The fluorescent lights of the subway car flickered as Michael Harrison sat alone on the blue plastic seat, his $1,000 suit a stark contrast to the graffiti-covered walls around him. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, and the successful investment banker had just left another 16-hour workday at his Manhattan office. His mind was racing with stock portfolios and quarterly reports when the doors slid open at the 42nd Street station, and she walked in. She couldn't have been more than 24 years old. Her blonde hair hung in tangled waves around her pale face, and her military green jacket was worn at the elbows and stained with dirt. But it wasn't her disheveled appearance that made Michael's breath catch in his throat. It was the tiny bundle she cradled against her chest, a baby, no more than 3 or 4 months old, wrapped in a thin beige blanket that had seen better days. The young woman's eyes darted around the nearly empty car, and Michael watched as she chose a seat 3 rows away from him. She sat down carefully, adjusting the baby with movements so gentle and practiced that it was clear this child was everything to her. The infant stirred slightly, letting out a soft whimper, and the young mother immediately began rocking back and forth, humming a melody so quiet it was almost inaudible over the rumble of the train. Michael found himself unable to look away. In the harsh subway lighting, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the chapped skin on her hands, the way her jacket hung loosely on her thin frame. She was starving. They both were. And suddenly, Michael wasn't seeing a stranger anymore. He was seeing his own daughter, Emma, who was safe at home with her grandmother right now, probably already tucked into her warm bed with her favorite stuffed rabbit. The train lurched forward, heading downtown toward Brooklyn. Michael's stop was coming up in 2 minutes, and he knew he should just mind his own business. New York City was full of people in need, and you couldn't help them all. That's what his colleagues always said during lunch when they passed homeless people on the street. Don't make eye contact, they'll just spend it on drugs anyway. But this was different. This was a baby. Michael's hand moved almost unconsciously to his wallet. He pulled it out and found himself staring at the black American Express card nestled among the others. It had no limit. He could buy a car with it if he wanted to. He could book a private jet to Paris. He could... His thoughts trailed off as the baby began to cry, a thin, desperate sound that echoed through the subway car. The young mother's face crumpled with worry. She opened her jacket and tried to nurse the child, but Michael could see her body tense with frustration. She wasn't producing enough milk. She was too malnourished to feed her own baby properly. The realization hit Michael like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just poverty. This was a mother watching her child starve, and there was nothing she could do about it. "Excuse me," Michael heard himself say, standing up and walking toward them before his rational mind could stop him. The young woman looked up sharply, her arms instinctively tightening around the baby. Her eyes were blue-green like sea glass and filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I don't want any trouble," she said quietly, her voice rough from cold or crying or both. "We're getting off at the next stop." "No, Michael stopped, realizing how he must look to her. A man in an expensive suit approaching a vulnerable woman alone on a late-night subway. He took a step back, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you. I have a daughter too. She's 7. The tension in the woman's shoulders eased slightly, but she still watched him warily. The baby had quieted now, sucking on a tiny fist, but Michael could see the way its small body seemed too light, too fragile in its mother's arms. "My name is Michael," he continued, sitting down across from her, maintaining a respectful distance. "I know this is going to sound crazy, and you have no reason to trust me. But I want to help you. Both of you." The young woman's jaw tightened. "We don't need charity," she said, but her voice cracked on the last word, betraying her. "We're fine." "I can see that you're not fine," Michael said gently, "and there's no shame in accepting help when you need it. Believe me, I know what it's like to be too proud to ask." He thought of the years after his wife died, when he'd struggled alone with a newborn, refusing his parents' offers to move in, insisting he could handle everything himself. He'd been wrong then, just as this young woman was wrong now. The train began to slow, approaching the Atlantic Avenue station. The young woman stood up, clutching the baby close. "This is my stop," she said, but she hesitated, looking down at Michael with an expression that was equal parts suspicion and desperate hope. Michael made a decision. He pulled out his wallet and removed the black credit card, holding it out to her. "Take this. Use it for 24 hours. Buy whatever you and your baby need: food, diapers, clothes, a hotel room with a warm shower. Tomorrow night, meet me back here, same car, same time, and give it back to me. That's all I ask." The young woman stared at the card as if it were a live snake. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me. I could max this out. I could disappear." "You could," Michael agreed. "But I don't think you will. Call it a leap of faith." He stood up and gently placed the card on the seat beside her. "My name is on it, Michael Harrison, and I'll be here tomorrow night at 11:47 p.m. waiting." The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. The young woman looked at the card, then at Michael, then at her baby, whose tiny lips were still working at nothing, searching for the nourishment that wasn't there. Tears began to slide down her cheeks. "I'm Sophie," she whispered, "and this is Lily." Then, before Michael could respond, she snatched up the card with trembling fingers and stepped off the train. The last thing Michael saw before the doors closed was Sophie standing on the platform, staring at the credit card in her hand as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. The train pulled away into the darkness, and Michael sat back down, his heart pounding. He had no idea if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life or the best decision he'd ever made. All he knew was that tomorrow night he'd be back on this train, waiting to find out what Sophie had done with his trust. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from his mother asking if he'd be home soon. Michael smiled sadly. Yes, he'd be home soon, to his penthouse apartment with its heated floors and fully stocked refrigerator, to his daughter sleeping peacefully in her comfortable bed. And somewhere out there in the cold November night, Sophie would be holding Lily, looking at a credit card that represented more money than she'd probably seen in her entire life, trying to decide what to do next. Michael pressed his forehead against the cold subway window and closed his eyes. 24 hours. In 24 hours, he'd know what kind of person Sophie really was. And maybe, just maybe, he'd discover something about himself too, about the kind of man he wanted to be, the kind of father he wanted Emma to look up to. The train rumbled on through the tunnels beneath Manhattan, carrying Michael home to his comfortable life, while Sophie disappeared into the night with his credit card, his trust, and the power to either restore his faith in humanity or destroy it completely. Only time would tell which path she'd choose, but for the first time in months, Michael felt truly alive, truly present, truly aware that sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones that don't make any logical sense at all. Sophie stood on the Atlantic Avenue platform long after the train disappeared into the tunnel, the black credit card burning like a hot coal in her trembling hand. The November wind whipped through the subway station, cutting through her thin jacket, but she barely felt it. Lily stirred against her chest, letting out a small whimper, and the sound snapped Sophie back to reality. She looked down at the card, Michael Harrison. The name was embossed in silver letters that caught the dim platform lights. No spending limit, he'd said. 24 hours. It felt like a test, like a trap, like a dream she'd wake up from any second. But the card was solid and real in her palm. And Lily was crying again, that desperate, hungry cry that had become the soundtrack of Sophie's nightmare existence over the past 3 months. "Okay, baby girl," Sophie whispered, kissing Lily's forehead with chapped lips. "Let's go find you some food." The first place she went was a 24-hour CVS pharmacy 3 blocks from the subway station. The automatic doors whooshed open, and Sophie stepped into the bright fluorescent warmth, suddenly aware of how she must look, how she must smell. The security guard near the entrance eyed her suspiciously, his hand moving subtly toward the radio on his belt. Sophie clutched Lily tighter and walked quickly to the baby aisle. Formula. The good kind, the organic one that the pediatrician at the free clinic had recommended, back when Sophie still had an apartment, back when she still had a life. It was $43 a can. Sophie picked up 2 cans, her hands shaking. Then she grabbed diapers, the jumbo pack, baby wipes, diaper rash cream, a pacifier, a soft blanket with little yellow ducks on it. By the time she reached the checkout counter, her arms were full, and her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. The cashier was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and purple reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She began scanning items without comment, but when Sophie placed the credit card on the counter, the woman paused. "This your card, honey?" she asked, and Sophie could hear the doubt in her voice. "Yes," Sophie lied, her throat tight. "It's mine." The cashier picked up the card and examined it, then looked at Sophie's dirty jacket, her tangled hair, the baby in her arms. For a moment, Sophie was certain the woman would refuse the transaction, would call the security guard, would accuse her of theft. She was already backing toward the door, preparing to run, when the cashier swiped the card. "Approved," the woman said softly, and then she did something that made Sophie's eyes fill with tears. She reached under the counter and pulled out a small stuffed bunny, white and fluffy with pink ears. "This one's on me," she said, tucking it into the bag with the other items. "For your little one. She's beautiful." Sophie couldn't speak. She just nodded, grabbed the bags, and hurried out into the night before the tears could fall. But they fell anyway, hot and fast, as she walked through the cold streets of Brooklyn with Lily in one arm and 2 shopping bags in the other. The cashier had been kind to her. When was the last time anyone had been kind to her? In a McDonald's bathroom that smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee, Sophie made a bottle of formula with hot water from the sink. Her hands were shaking so badly she spilled powder on the grimy floor, but she managed to mix it properly. When she finally offered the bottle to Lily, the baby latched on with desperate intensity, her tiny hands gripping the plastic as if it might be taken away at any moment. Sophie watched her daughter drink, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, baby girl." For 3 weeks now, Sophie had been trying to nurse Lily, knowing she wasn't producing enough milk, but unable to afford formula. She'd watched her baby lose weight, watched her cry from hunger, watched her grow listless and weak, and she'd hated herself for it, hated herself more than she'd ever hated anyone. But now Lily was drinking, really drinking, and the relief Sophie felt was so overwhelming it made her lightheaded. She sat on the closed toilet seat in that dirty bathroom and cried, while her daughter ate her first full meal in days. And for the first time since everything fell apart, Sophie allowed herself to feel something other than despair. She felt hope. By 2 a.m., Sophie had checked them into a Motel 6 near Prospect Park. The room was small and the carpet was stained, but there was a lock on the door and heat coming from the radiator and a bed with clean sheets. Sophie paid the $68 for one night without hesitation, still unable to believe that the credit card kept working, kept saying approved, kept giving her access to a life she'd thought was lost forever. She gave Lily a bath in the small sink, washing her carefully with the baby soap she'd bought at CVS. The water ran brown at first from the accumulated grime, but soon Lily's skin was clean and pink, and she was cooing happily, splashing her tiny hands in the warm water. Sophie washed herself in the shower, standing under the hot spray, until the water ran clear and her skin was red and tingling. She scrubbed her hair 3 times, working out the tangles and the dirt and the shame of sleeping rough for 3 months. When she finally climbed into bed with Lily beside her, both of them clean and fed and warm, Sophie thought she might be dreaming. She picked up the credit card from the nightstand and studied it again. Michael Harrison. Who was he? Why had he done this? What did he expect from her? The rational part of Sophie's brain, the part that had kept her alive on the streets, that had taught her to trust no one and expect nothing, told her that Michael Harrison must want something. Men didn't just give away their credit cards without expecting something in return, but another part of her, a part she'd thought was dead, whispered that maybe, just maybe, there were still good people in the world. People who helped because they could, because they should, because they saw another human being in pain and couldn't look away. Sophie set the card down and pulled Lily close, breathing in her baby-fresh scent. Tomorrow, she would go shopping again. She'd buy Lily the clothes she needed, the medicine for the rash on her bottom, the teething toys she was too young for but would need soon. She'd buy herself a decent meal, maybe some new clothes so she wouldn't look quite so much like the homeless person she was. And then, tomorrow night at 11:47 p.m., she would return to that subway car and give the card back to Michael Harrison, just as she'd promised. But what Sophie didn't know, what she couldn't have known as she drifted off to sleep in that cheap motel room, was that Michael Harrison was lying awake in his penthouse apartment at that very moment, staring at his phone and wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd checked his credit card statement online at least 20 times since getting home, watching the charges come through. CVS Pharmacy, 187.43. McDonald's, 8-67. Motel 6, 68 Michael smiled in the darkness of his bedroom. She was buying baby supplies. She was feeding her child. She was getting them somewhere safe to sleep. She wasn't maxing out his card at luxury stores or jewelry shops or casinos. She was being a mother, doing what mothers do, protecting their children, providing for them, putting their needs above everything else. His daughter Emma appeared in his doorway, silhouetted by the nightlight in the hallway. "Daddy, why are you still awake?" She was clutching her stuffed rabbit, her dark hair messy from sleep. "Just thinking, sweetheart," Michael said softly. "Come here." Emma padded across the room and climbed into bed beside him, snuggling against his side. "Thinking about what?" "About how lucky we are," Michael said, kissing the top of her head. "About how we should always help people when we can. About how sometimes doing the right thing means taking a risk." "Is this about the homeless lady you told Grandma about?" Emma asked. At 7 years old, she was already too perceptive for her own good. "The one with the baby?" "Yeah," Michael admitted. "It is." "I think you did a good thing, Daddy," Emma said sleepily. "Mommy would have been proud." The words hit Michael like a lightning bolt. His wife, Sarah, had died from cancer when Emma was just 6 months old, and in the 7 years since, Michael had thrown himself into his work, using success as armor against grief. He'd become wealthy, powerful, respected, but had he become good? Had he become the kind of man Sarah had believed he could be? "You really think so?" he whispered. But Emma was already asleep, breathing softly against his shoulder. Michael lay there in the darkness, watching the city lights flicker through his floor-to-ceiling windows, and thought about Sophie. Was she sleeping right now? Was Lily finally fed and comfortable? What had Sophie's life been like before everything fell apart? Because Michael knew with absolute certainty that women didn't end up homeless with infants unless something catastrophic had happened. There was a story there, a tragedy, and tomorrow night he would hear it. The credit card charges continued to come through over the next few hours. Target, $156.78. A children's consignment shop, $43.50. A diner in Park Slope, $22. Michael watched them all, each one telling him a story about a young mother trying desperately to rebuild her life in the space of 24 hours, trying to create some foundation of normalcy for her baby daughter. And with each charge, Michael felt his faith in humanity inch back from the cynical place it had retreated to over the years. Sophie could have spent thousands. She could have bought designer clothes, expensive electronics, lavish meals. Instead, she was spending carefully, thoughtfully, like someone who understood the value of money because she'd lived without it for so long. Tomorrow night couldn't come fast enough. Michael needed to see Sophie again, needed to know that his instinct about her had been right, needed to prove to himself that kindness wasn't weakness and trust wasn't foolishness. He needed to know that in a city of 8 million people, in a world that often felt cold and cruel, there were still moments of grace, still connections that mattered, still reasons to believe that we could be better to each other. As dawn broke over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Michael finally fell asleep with his daughter in his arms and hope in his heart. In 24 hours, he would know whether his leap of faith had been justified. In 24 hours, everything would change. Sophie woke up at 6 a.m. to the sound of Lily babbling happily in the motel bed beside her. For a terrifying moment, she didn't know where she was. The clean sheets, the warm room, the absence of street noise all felt wrong, impossible. Then she remembered. The subway, the man in the suit, the credit card that had changed everything in the span of a few hours. She picked up Lily and held her close, breathing in the clean baby scent of her daughter's hair. In the morning light, streaming through the thin motel curtains, Lily looked different, healthier, pinker, more alert. Her eyes were bright and curious instead of dull with hunger, and when she smiled up at Sophie, it was the most beautiful thing Sophie had ever seen. "We have one more day, baby girl," Sophie whispered. "One more day to get everything we need before we go back to reality." But even as she said it, Sophie knew that wasn't quite right. She wasn't planning to steal from Michael Harrison. She was going to return his card tonight, just as promised. But the truth was, Sophie didn't know what reality looked like anymore. She couldn't go back to sleeping in subway stations and park benches with a 4-month-old baby. She couldn't keep pretending that she could survive this alone. She fed Lily another bottle of formula, watching her daughter drink with the same desperate relief she'd felt last night. Then Sophie did something she hadn't done in 3 months. She sat down and actually thought about her situation, instead of just surviving it minute by minute. The truth was brutal and simple. Sophie had nothing. No apartment, no job, no family, no support system. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 19, and she'd been on her own ever since. She'd met Jake, Lily's father, when she was 22, and for 2 years she'd thought she'd finally found someone who would stay, someone who would build a life with her. Then she got pregnant, and Jake disappeared 3 days after she told him, leaving behind nothing but an empty apartment and 2 months of unpaid rent. Sophie had tried to make it work. She'd kept her job as a waitress until she was 8 months pregnant, working double shifts and saving every penny. But the restaurant closed down 2 weeks before Lily was born, and suddenly Sophie was unemployed, about to give birth, with no savings and no prospects. She'd given birth to Lily in a public hospital, and when they'd been discharged 3 days later, Sophie had gone back to the apartment to find an eviction notice on the door. That was 4 months ago. Since then, Sophie had been living in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She'd stayed in homeless shelters when she could get a bed, but most nights they were full, and Sophie found herself sleeping in subway stations, in hospital waiting rooms, in 24-hour diners where sympathetic waitresses looked the other way as long as she ordered coffee. She'd applied for government assistance, but the paperwork was overwhelming, and she had no permanent address to use. She'd tried to find work, but who would hire a homeless woman with an infant and no childcare? And through it all, Lily had suffered. Sweet, innocent Lily, who had done nothing to deserve this life, who deserved warm beds and full bottles, and a mother who wasn't slowly starving to death. The guilt Sophie felt was crushing, suffocating, a weight she carried every second of every day. But yesterday, on that subway train, a stranger had seen her. Really seen her, not just as another homeless person to ignore, but as a human being, a mother, someone worthy of help. And that simple act of kindness had given Sophie something she'd lost weeks ago, the will to fight back. She left the motel at 8 a.m., Lily strapped to her chest in a new baby carrier she'd bought at Target the night before. Sophie had a plan for today, and she was going to use every remaining hour of Michael Harrison's generosity to execute it. Her first stop was a public library in Park Slope. Sophie hadn't been inside a library in months. She'd been too ashamed, too afraid of being kicked out for looking homeless. But this morning, wearing the clean clothes she'd bought yesterday, with her hair washed and pulled back in a neat ponytail, she walked through those doors with her head held high. She settled at a computer station with Lily in her lap and spent 2 hours doing what she should have done months ago, researching resources for homeless mothers. She found emergency housing programs, job training initiatives, childcare subsidies, legal aid clinics. She wrote down phone numbers and addresses on the free notepaper the library provided, filling page after page with information that felt like lifelines being thrown to a drowning woman. A librarian approached her, an older woman with silver hair and kind wrinkles around her eyes. "Can I help you find anything?" she asked, and Sophie could hear genuine concern in her voice, not pity or judgment, just human kindness. "I need to find a job," Sophie said quietly, "and a place to live, for me and my daughter." The librarian didn't hesitate. "Let me show you something," she said, and she spent the next 30 minutes helping Sophie update her resume, showing her websites for employment agencies that specialized in helping women in crisis, giving her printed pamphlets about organizations Sophie had never heard of, but that might save her life. "You're going to be okay," the librarian said as Sophie prepared to leave, and she squeezed Sophie's hand with warm fingers. "You're already doing the hard part. You're trying. That's more than most people can say." Sophie's next stop was a small consignment shop in Cobble Hill that sold professional clothing at affordable prices. She spent $93 on 2 interview outfits, simple blouses and pants that made her look like the person she used to be before everything fell apart. The shop owner, a petite woman with a thick Russian accent, threw in a black blazer for free when Sophie explained she was job hunting. "You have good face," the woman said, pinning Sophie with sharp eyes. "Strong. You will find work. I see it." By early afternoon, Sophie had accomplished more in 6 hours than she had in 3 months. She had information, resources, a plan. She had clothes that would help her get a job and the beginnings of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could pull herself and Lily out of this nightmare. But there was one more thing she needed to do, and it was the hardest thing of all. Sophie took the subway to Manhattan to the Upper West Side, to an address she'd looked up on the library computer that morning. The building was beautiful, a pre-war apartment complex with a doorman and a marble lobby and the kind of old money elegance that Sophie had only seen in movies. She stood across the street for a long time, watching people come and go, trying to gather her courage. This was where Michael Harrison lived. She'd found him easily enough. There weren't many investment bankers named Michael Harrison in Manhattan, and his LinkedIn profile had been public. She'd seen his photo, read about his career, learned that he was a widower raising a 7-year-old daughter alone. And suddenly Sophie understood why he'd helped her. He knew what it was like to be a single parent. He knew how hard it was, how terrifying, how lonely. Sophie wasn't planning to knock on his door. That would be creepy and invasive and wrong. But she needed to see where he lived, needed to understand who this man was, who had changed her life with a single act of trust. She needed to know that he was real, that this wasn't all some elaborate trick or test. A black town car pulled up to the building's entrance, and Sophie watched as Michael Harrison stepped out, wearing another expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase. But there was something different about him today. He looked tired, distracted, like his mind was somewhere else. He spoke briefly to the doorman, checked his phone, then disappeared into the building. Sophie stood there on the cold sidewalk, Lily asleep against her chest, and felt tears running down her face again. This man, this wealthy, successful, important man, had given her his credit card and his trust, and she suddenly realized the weight of that gift. It wasn't just about the money, though, that had literally saved Lily's life. It was about being seen, being valued, being treated like a human being who mattered. And Sophie knew, with absolute certainty, that she was going to honor that trust. She was going to return his card tonight. She was going to look him in the eye and tell him what his kindness had meant. And then she was going to use the foundation he'd helped her build to change her life. Sophie spent the rest of the afternoon making phone calls from a Starbucks, using Michael's credit card to buy a cheap, prepaid cell phone first. She called the emergency housing programs, got herself on waiting lists, scheduled intake appointments. She called the job placement services, arranged interviews for next week. She called social services and finally got someone on the phone who walked her through the assistance application process step by step. By 6 p.m., Sophie was exhausted but triumphant. She'd accomplished more in one day than most people accomplish in a month. She'd used Michael Harrison's 24 hours of grace to build a ladder out of the pit she'd been trapped in, and she was ready to start climbing. She spent her last few hours in a diner, eating a proper meal and nursing Lily. The waitress, a young woman about Sophie's age, brought her extra bread without being asked, and smiled when Lily grabbed at her fingers. "She's precious," the waitress said. "You're lucky." "I know," Sophie replied, and for the first time in months she actually felt it. Lucky, blessed, grateful. At 11:30 p.m., Sophie was back on the subway, heading toward 42nd Street. She was wearing her new interview clothes, and Lily was dressed in a warm sleeper with little moons and stars on it. Sophie's hands were shaking as the train rattled through the tunnels, but it wasn't fear this time. It was anticipation. She wanted to see Michael Harrison again. She wanted to thank him properly. She wanted him to know that his leap of faith hadn't been wasted, that he'd saved 2 lives with a single gesture of kindness. She wanted him to understand that he'd given her more than money or resources. He'd given her back her humanity, her dignity, her belief that she deserved better and could achieve it. The train pulled into the 42nd Street station at exactly 11:47 p.m. Sophie stood up, adjusted Lily in her arms, and pulled Michael Harrison's credit card from her pocket. She'd spent $847.23 in 24 hours, less than some people spent on a single dinner in this city. But with that money, she'd bought hope, survival, and a future. The doors slid open, and Sophie stepped onto the platform, her heart hammering with nervous excitement. Time to face the man who had changed everything. Time to return what she'd borrowed and begin the long journey of building the life she and Lily deserved. The train car was waiting. And so, she hoped, was Michael Harrison. Michael Harrison sat in the same subway car, on the same blue plastic seat, at exactly 11:47 p.m., just as he'd promised. His hands were sweating despite the November chill seeping through the train doors, and he'd checked his watch at least 50 times in the past hour. Would she come? Had he been a fool to trust a complete stranger? Had Sophie disappeared into the city with his credit card, never to be seen again? He'd told himself it didn't matter. The $847.23 she'd spent was nothing to him. He spent more than that on a business dinner, but that wasn't true, and Michael knew it. It mattered enormously. Not because of the money, but because he needed to believe that goodness still existed in the world, that people could be trusted, that his daughter Emma was growing up in a place where kindness was rewarded rather than exploited. The train doors opened at 42nd Street, and Michael's breath caught in his throat. There she was. Sophie stepped into the subway car, and for a moment, Michael didn't recognize her. Gone was the desperate, bedraggled young woman from 2 nights ago. In her place stood someone transformed, hair clean and pulled back neatly, wearing a professional navy blouse and black pants, holding Lily with confidence rather than the defensive desperation he'd seen before. But it was her eyes that struck him most. They were still the same sea-glass blue-green, but now they held something they hadn't before. Hope. "Mr. Harrison," Sophie said quietly, moving toward him with careful steps. "You came." "I promised I would," Michael replied, standing up. Please call me Michael." Sophie reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out his credit card, holding it between them like a sacred object. "I need to give this back to you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I need to say thank you. The words feel too small, too inadequate for what you've done for us, but thank you. You saved our lives." Michael took the card, but he didn't look at it. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Sophie's face, from the tears that were beginning to spill down her cheeks, from the raw emotion written there. "Tell me what happened," he said gently. "Not just in the last 24 hours. Tell me how you ended up on this train 2 nights ago." And Sophie did. Standing there in that subway car as it rumbled through the tunnels beneath Manhattan, she told him everything. About her parents dying when she was 19, about Jake disappearing when she got pregnant, about losing her job and her apartment, about 4 months of hell living on the streets with a newborn baby. She told him about the guilt and the shame and the desperate fear that she was failing Lily, that she was the worst mother in the world for putting her daughter through this nightmare. "I thought about giving her up," Sophie whispered, the confession clearly painful. "I thought she'd be better off with someone else, someone who could actually take care of her, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't let her go. She's all I have. She's everything." Michael felt his own eyes burning with tears. He thought about Emma, about how he'd felt after Sarah died, about the overwhelming terror of being solely responsible for another human being's life. "You're not a bad mother," he said firmly. "You're a mother who was dealt an impossible hand. There's a difference. The things you did last night and today, the library, the job applications, the housing programs, that's not failing. That's fighting. That's being exactly the mother Lily needs." Sophie's face crumpled, and she let out a sob that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Lily stirred in her arms, and Sophie immediately began rocking her, soothing her, even in the midst of her own breakdown. It was pure instinct, pure maternal love, and Michael felt his heart break and heal simultaneously at the sight. "Here's what's going to happen," Michael said, making a decision he'd been mulling over all day. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to meet me at my office. I've already made some calls. There's a women's shelter in Brooklyn, a good one, safe and clean, that has a room available for you and Lily. It's yours for 3 months while you get on your feet." Sophie's eyes widened. "Michael, I can't—" "Yes, you can," he interrupted gently. "And there's more. My company has an entry-level position open in our administrative department. It's not glamorous, but it pays a living wage and has full benefits, including childcare assistance. You have an interview tomorrow at 2 p.m. I'm not promising you the job, you'll have to earn that yourself, but I'm promising you a fair shot. Why? Sophie asked, her voice breaking. Why are you doing all this for me? You don't even know me. Michael thought about that question. He thought about Sarah, about how she'd always seen the best in people, how she'd believed that wealth came with responsibility, that those who had much should give much. He thought about Emma, about the values he wanted to instill in her, about the kind of world he wanted her to grow up in. And he thought about himself, about the man he'd become after Sarah died, closed off, focused on success and security, forgetting that the point of having resources was to use them to make a difference. I'm doing it because I can, Michael said simply. And because you deserve it, because Lily deserves it, and because 2 nights ago you did something that most people in your situation wouldn't have done. You returned my trust. You spent less than $1,000 when you could have spent tens of thousands. You bought baby formula and a motel room and job interview clothes instead of jewelry or designer bags or electronics you could pawn. You proved that you're exactly the kind of person worth investing in. The train pulled into the Atlantic Avenue station, Sophie's stop. But this time, everything was different. This time, Sophie wasn't stepping off into uncertainty and fear. This time, she was stepping off into possibility. I don't know how to repay you, Sophie said as the doors opened. You don't repay it, Michael said. You pay it forward. Someday, when you're stable and successful and Lily is grown, you help someone else the way I helped you. That's how this works. That's how we make the world better. Sophie nodded, tears streaming freely now. Then, impulsively, she reached out and hugged Michael with one arm, Lily still cradled in the other. I won't let you down, she whispered. I promise. I know you won't, Michael replied. Sophie stepped off the train, then turned back one last time. Michael, your daughter, Emma, right? She's lucky to have you as a father. The doors closed before Michael could respond, and he watched through the scratched subway windows as Sophie stood on the platform, holding Lily close, both of them bathed in the harsh fluorescent light. And then the train pulled away, carrying Michael back toward his life, while Sophie stood on the edge of hers, ready to begin again. 3 years later, Michael Harrison sat in his office on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, reviewing quarterly reports when his assistant knocked on the door. Mr. Harrison, Sophie Chen is here to see you. Michael looked up, surprised. He hadn't seen Sophie in person in almost 2 years, though they'd stayed in touch via email and occasional phone calls. He'd watched from a distance as she'd thrived, getting the job in his company's administrative department, then being promoted to executive assistant, then being accepted into a night school program for business management. He'd received updates about Lily, seen photos of the little girl growing up healthy and happy, celebrated quietly when Sophie moved from the shelter into her own apartment. Send her in, Michael said, standing up. Sophie walked into his office, and Michael barely recognized her. She wore a sharp business suit, her hair was professionally styled, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd fought for every inch of ground she stood on and won. But her smile was the same, warm and genuine and full of gratitude. I hope I'm not interrupting, Sophie said. Never, Michael replied. It's good to see you. How's Lily? She's amazing, starting preschool next month. Sophie's eyes lit up when she talked about her daughter, and Michael could see the fierce, protective love there, stronger than ever. But I'm not here to talk about Lily. I'm here to talk about you. She pulled an envelope from her purse and handed it to Michael. Inside was a check for $847.23, the exact amount Sophie had spent 3 years ago. Sophie, you don't need to— Yes, I do, she interrupted firmly. You told me to pay it forward, and I will. I already volunteer at a homeless shelter every weekend, and I've started a fund to help single mothers in crisis. But before I do all that, I needed to pay back the man who saved my life, because you didn't just give me money, Michael. You gave me dignity. You treated me like a human being when everyone else looked through me like I was invisible, and I need you to know that I've never forgotten that, and I never will. Michael took the check, his throat tight with emotion. I'm proud of you, he said simply. So incredibly proud. I couldn't have done it without you, Sophie replied. Then she smiled, mischievous and bright. Oh, and one more thing. I've been accepted to NYU's MBA program. Part-time, so I can keep working and taking care of Lily. I start in the fall. Michael laughed, shaking his head in amazement. Of course you have. You're going to run your own company someday, aren't you? Maybe, Sophie said with a grin. And when I do, I'm going to make sure it's the kind of company that treats people with dignity, that remembers that everyone has a story, that gives second chances to those who need them. After Sophie left, Michael stood at his office windows, looking out over Manhattan. He thought about that night 3 years ago, about the split-second decision to hand his credit card to a desperate stranger, about how terrified he'd been that he was making a mistake. He'd gone home that night and checked his credit card statement obsessively, watching each charge come through, hoping desperately that his faith wouldn't be misplaced. And it hadn't been. Sophie had proven that people could be trusted, that kindness mattered, that one act of generosity could change the trajectory of an entire life, not just hers and Lily's, but his own as well. Because helping Sophie had reminded Michael of who he wanted to be, had shown Emma what it meant to use privilege responsibly, had restored his faith in humanity at a time when he'd almost lost it completely. Michael pulled out his phone and texted Emma, who was now 10 years old and in 4th grade. Proud of you, sweetheart. Remember, we help people whenever we can. That's what Mum would have wanted. That's who we are. Emma's response came seconds later. I know, Dad. Love you. Michael smiled and tucked the check from Sophie into his wallet, next to a photograph of Sarah. He wouldn't cash it. Instead, he'd frame it as a reminder that the best investment we can ever make is in each other, that kindness has compound interest that pays dividends for years, that sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply seeing another person's humanity and honoring it. Outside his window, the city stretched endlessly in all directions, 8 million people living 8 million stories, some tragic and some triumphant, some beginning and some ending. And somewhere down there in an apartment in Brooklyn, a young woman was picking up her daughter from daycare, helping her with her homework, cooking dinner, living the ordinary, beautiful life that had once seemed impossible. All because one man decided to trust, and one woman decided to prove herself worthy of that trust. All because, on a cold November night in a graffiti-covered subway car, 2 strangers chose kindness over cynicism, connection over indifference, hope over despair. And that, Michael thought as he turned back to his work, was everything. That was the whole point. That was what it meant to be human.